All right. All right, cool. So let's start. As you can guess, hello Sajid. Right, taking a break from all the food ordering and various other things I'm cooking up for you ungrateful children. I think the main focus for this workshop was on BP, and I think the primary target audience for this is not probably best speaker in Asia, but for the various teams coming from outside of Dhaka, multitude of novice teams that are going to be in the tournament, and the school children from various schools who are going to be participating and who we're most excited to have that ascension. So keeping that in mind, and keeping in mind that we have a pretty short time, I think what I'll start with, if it's okay with you guys, is a basic outline of BP debating and how it works, because it seems simple because you've done a lot of other different debates, but it's very simple to mess it up and be engulfed in all the technicalities. So I think feel free to use the comment section to ask any questions, or if you can't hear me or if you're encountering any technical difficulties, you can just comment there and I'll try my best to respond. We will try to wrap this around 10:20, 10:25-ish, okay, or earlier as cool. So in terms of BP, the biggest difference, obviously, from 3-on-3 is that 3-on-3 is something that's very dependent on spontaneity, on quick wit, thinking on your feet, and responding to your opponents the best way you can as you follow each other's speeches. BP is a lot more pre-anticipated and calculated, so you have to weigh everything you're going to say and especially work on how you want things to land in each of your speeches. So first up, the four houses and their distinct purposes, right? So opening garment, people, definitely I did, was used to freak out a lot when they get OG because you think you're screwed because there's a fear associated with going first. But I think OG is where you have the most control, and it's actually the safest place to be in because you can do as you wish with the motion, and people are bound to sort of follow the debate that you are setting up, and that's really important. So for a prime minister, as you go up and give the first, you are pretty much safe, and that allows the debate to go on and make it safe for everyone as well. So I think the first most important thing to do when you're prime minister, know that you have to set up a context. Context basically means the storyline behind why this motion has been set and why you're going to be giving your speech. It has to be very clear from the beginning what you're trying to set up and where you want this debate headed. Um, for a long time, I think one of the most common questions in BP workshop is definitions. What do I have to define? Can I challenge the definition? I think in 2017's debate scenario, definitions is not something you really have to worry about. Context takes priority and precedence. So you have to set up that story, you have to set up that context. For example, if there's a debate on, let's say, taking away Nobel Prize for someone who hasn't done very nice things, you as an informed debater should be immediately setting up the context of where this is the most burning issue and where it's reached a sort of tipping point. And that sort of brings to mind examples such as Myanmar or various other examples, right? And that has to be very prevalent in your context. Without setting up a proper context and without setting up where you want this debate to land, you run the risk of letting other teams define this for you, and you start losing out control. From opening garment, you want to constrict as much control as possible. Because with so many other speeches coming up after yours, it's inevitable that control and content will slip away. But if you have nailed down the context, if you've nailed down key arguments that are continuing throughout the debate, that means as an OG, you've done something right, and the judge is forced to give you some sort of credit for the good setup that you've done, So make sure context and characterization is a key focus. Um, Another common thing I've seen being pursued in the circuit is first speaker goes up and tries to sort of throw everything at the judge and at the other teams. This might work at times, sure, but I think it also runs the risk of backfiring because you end up not sort of going through things in enough detail. So a case split is really important. So if I think of an ideal prime minister, it has to be a good context. For sure, that's the most important part. It has to be very clear to the judge who the debate is about, what sort of society or country or world we're talking about, and where this is happening. In the case of motions which require a particular policy, that has to be clear from you as soon as you see the motion. For example, if there's a debate about relocating refugees, there's an expectation that you're going to talk about how this relocation is going to be done. So that's when you need to sort of come in with the model. All right? So context, model if needed, and then splitting up the arguments and flagging this. This is really important because in BP, with so many different speeches, the reality is some judges will fall asleep, some judges will play Fruit Ninja, and some judges just don't have the capacity to sort of process so many different strategic things happening at the same time. So it's your duty to sort of flag things and set up where this discussion is happening and what the discussion is about. Okay. So to summarize, I think we have a question here about what a model is. So a model basically is something that you don't have to use all the time, but in some debates, you will understand as a debater that some sort of expectation is there to provide a policy. So for example, if there's a debate about, there's a very hypothetical debate about having a love potion, you probably don't need a model. But if there is a motion which says you need to relocate refugees, you need to military intervene somewhere, that point, some sort of strategic and realistic discussion is probably needed. I think the best example of a model I can give you is the WDC final with the motion which is this house would invade Zimbabwe. I think even 7 years from now, it's the best example of the most comprehensive and working model I've seen. Another really good example is WDC 2010. There's a debate on Twitter, and from I think London School of Economics A, I'm not sure, you get one of the best models again. So there are lots of good examples of working models out there. When I started debating, and I never had the privilege of debating in school, finding a model was something that really plagued my mind. But then I think for models, there's no foolproof formula. And it's crazy to expect you guys to come up with foolproof working models for real life problems. I think MUN's community is probably more suited for that. But for policies in debate, read a lot. You will see that there are places in the world who are accurately solving a lot of problems using various methods. Those methods can be adopted and plugged into different debates that you're doing as well. For example, a successful example of military intervention in Africa was Botswana into Tanzania, I believe, or the other way around. At the same time, there are numerous models which have worked. So for example, in Australia, they've run a very successful cash in exchange for fertility for parents program. So these are examples you can plug into other countries as well, right? So figure out what's working for a different context and see if that can be molded and adapted to fit into your context. Cool. I hope that answers the question on models. Coming back to the roles, okay? So first speech in a debate is opening government. As we've discussed already, the prime minister. Next up would be the leader of opposition from OO, opening opposition, right? Opening opposition is also a very difficult position. And I think the first thing I would like to flag is the most common mistake I've seen in my years of adjudication, which is the leader of opposition aggressively jumps right into the opening government debate, which is half correct. It is your massive burden from opening opposition to engage with prime minister. But the biggest risk of aggressively going into everything is that you end up getting sucked into parts of the opening government debate that aren't good and won't be as long lasting as other arguments will be, which is where opening opposition sort of degrades and loses out on their quality as well, because you allow closing to come in and do more relevant engagement. So from opening opposition, the most important thing to do is do the correct relevant engagement. Don't get sucked into parts of the debate which will end up strategically hurting you. And try your best to seize control of the debate and make sure that your stance or your arguments is something that continues, because your relevance is going to be tested like very badly. Deputy Prime Minister and Deputy Leader of Opposition are tasked with backing up your previous speakers and making sure you fill in any blanks that they've left behind. So those are, I think, pretty self-explanatory because you guys, most of you have done a lot of debates already. Where I believe most of the questions will be coming in is the lower house because that's where you have less experience. Closing government and closing opposition. So of course, the most dreaded thing is being told that your extension wasn't good or your extension lacked analysis or wasn't new. Yeah, so extension is a new dynamic that you bring into the debate from closing. So it necessarily doesn't have to be something completely fresh. That's a big misconception. If you are able to come up with something that's new and relevant, that's great. That's a very good thing to have in closing government. So for example, if there's a debate on women in the workplace, and perhaps the opening government focused specifically on benefits in the workplace, and closing comes in and extends this debate to talk about how this inspires other women in society, leads to improvements in things like women being enrolled in STEM education and various other things. That's a positive extension of them taking this debate away from offices and onto societies and work and mass society as a whole as well, right? So that's an example of a good extension. Closing opposition is a trickier part, but for both lower house teams, it's about an extension. So what an extension is a new value addition into the debate. And I think what's most important here is how you're framing your arguments. I've written some stuff up on framing that I think will be helpful for you guys, right? So the true reality is that judges often latch onto specific sound bites that teams provide. And this is especially relevant for closing. So if there's a judge who's sitting there watching you speak, and what they realize is that you're essentially repeating what upper house already said, chances are more often than not, they will tune out of the debate. I like to think I don't do that, but there are probably judges that do, right? And so when they tune out of the debate, you automatically lose relevance, and you can probably see it while you're speaking that it's not working out for you. To overcome this problem, you need to frame your extension or your material in closing correctly. So judges will latch onto the correct soundbite, right? Like, so whatever you say has to be distinct. It has to not be too complex. It has to be fairly obvious, and it can't be abstract. I think that's a massive problem in the debating circuit. We get caught up so much in morality, principles, etc., that it ends up being too vague for the average reasonable person to assess you. So be distinct, be good sounding, that's fine, but don't be too vague and abstract with your rhetoric and what you're trying to say. It has to be linkable back to your entire debate. So distinct, to the point, and not too abstract, and well linked. So ideally, whatever you frame and flag as your extensions or as the new material you're going to bring in has to help you throughout the rest of your speech as well and flow into the rest of your material. So for example, if I look back at Brackmaster's final 2 years back, or maybe a year back, which I was in, we had the pleasure of winning it from CO. And the framing of the argument and the debate was about demolition of statues, was that when statues don't speak. Okay, so as soon as you say statues don't speak, that's probably not an everyday sentence, so it's very distinct and people remember. Because this motion is very related to statues, it's not too abstract. People are probably understanding that, okay, there is some sort of continuation here, and then you bridge in that continuation with your arguments. So if the framing is statues don't speak and the judge is paying attention, the next flow is the arguments you otherwise would have just run separately, you can now link those back to this frame. So following on from statues don't speak is arguments about how people make up rumors, how the entire process of normal discourse and narratives now gets shifted over onto grounds of speculation or being too abstract, how statues perhaps had a role to play in solidifying history, but now things are more muddled and more unclear and clarity is lost overall. So these arguments in on itself could have been probably have already been mentioned by your upper house. But when connected and uniquely attributed to the loss of statues in this particular framing, they become and they bear more weightage and can continue on throughout the debate, right? So I think that's a good indication of how framing something in a memorable, concise, and continuous way helps you stay relevant throughout the debate. Relevant is a buzzword I think you guys will be hearing a lot throughout this tournament, and for British parliamentary debating, that's the most important thing. So 3-on-3, as I was saying earlier, is a lot quicker and a lot more spontaneous, but BP is a lot more strategic. So opening garment sets up the context. Opening opposition engages to that particular context. Lower house teams have to add new value to the debate. So you sit, you take stock of what's been discussed in the debate already, and you weigh where you can come in. As lower house teams, you get an extra 30 minutes of prep time. Use it wisely. Stay very alive in the debate and note down everything that's happening and pinpoint where exactly you can come in and add new value and make your own original contribution. Some mistakes to avoid here is POIs, for example, are such a good strategic tool to stay relevant throughout the debate. So don't just do them spontaneously and aggressively. Time them, write them down, discuss them with your teammate, and use them to help you stay relevant or send your opposing team on tangents of irrelevance, which ultimately helps you stay relevant. You want to stay relevant as long as possible. So in terms of lore house, when you have to come up with ways of adding new value. So this comes with engaging upper house. It comes with also extending and bringing in new material of different grounds which have not been covered. There are also particular techniques which you can apply here. So for example, it's not just about jumping into lots of new material. If you can do that, that's great. But more often than not, you won't be able to. So then you can focus on a specific context or a specific aspect of argumentation and run with it and convince the judge that this is absolutely the most important thing to talk about in the debate. So if various aspects of society are being discussed, so good example is in Greece, there was a motion about cult of feminism, about celebrity pop stars and why they're a bad thing. So this is a vast topic, so there's a lot of discussion. So opening garment is discussed as painting the context of how people like Beyonce and Taylor Swift have had an effect. Opening opposition is engaging that. Then from lower house, closing garment, which I was in this debate, I extended on what opening garment said and had lots of new material about the impact celebrities have on a person's life, etc., etc. But closing opposition in this debate nails down one particular aspect, which was the role that these celebrity females have on women and their bodies and on their aspects of womanhood and whether they feel better under the context of living with these celebrities and being their fans, or do they feel worse when they don't have them. This particular context was enough to convince the judge that this is the most important part of the debate, that despite all the celebrity stuff that's been back and forth that has happened, a particular framing that stood out for the judge was, do the existence of these sort of celebrity cults help women feel more comfortable and be more engaged in discussions about their body and discussions about women's rights in general in society? And they managed to prove that right, and they took the debate, right? So you want to stay as relevant as possible and be particular about where you're going to be arguing. So if you think there's too much happening in the debate, talk to your partner and figure out where you think you can add the most value and which particular aspect of this debate might help you win. So, and that's how you sort of latch on and convince the judge that this is the most important part of the debate. So the extension speaker would be presenting the extension, would be presenting ideally integrated rebuttals. So a lot of time can be lost doing loose rebuttals of everyone in the debate. So the best way to save that is by doing integrated rebuttals where your extension or your new ideas are sort of connected to rebuttal as well. So if you are going to say that, okay, let's think of emotion. So if there is a debate on, let's say, social media as a primary source of news distribution and how that's a bad thing, if there has been a lot of discussion on how social media leads to fake news, and your extension is that you have an extension about how the existence of social media is good because people are otherwise inattentive and unengaged. So now you want them engaged. So when you're engaging this, what you can sort of do is say that, okay, even if social media is used by the mass, you don't particularly agree with this because people are perhaps engaging in conversation, but it's the quality of discourse that actually matters. And the quality of discourse is what's going to be the most important metric in this debate. So your extension is about how quality of discourse is affected. But this same argument is also a rebuttal to the idea that the other side has presented about social media needing to be a good platform to engage the mass audience, right? So you're killing two birds with one stone where you're engaging their idea about how it engages mass people. At the same time, you're bringing in your new extension as well about how it affects quality of discourse. Okay, Fardeen, to answer your question about POIs, I think, yeah, taking POIs randomly is a very detrimental thing for your case and for your strategy. So if you're in lower house, it's best not to raise POIs because you run the risk of giving away what your extension or what your original matter could have been. You allow perhaps the second speaker from that side to figure this out and integrate that into their case. A very clever way to supplant this is to raise a POI that about an idea that you don't probably want to run, but you just sort of want to send your upper house into a needless tangent about things. That's one way to do it. But these sort of advanced and like silly tactics usually aren't massive game changers, but can come in handy in tight rooms. Um, when you're in lower house, you ideally want to take POIs twice, one from upper and one from the team right opposing you. But the priority should be to take the POI from upper because you will get the chance to engage lower house, but there won't be a lot of interaction between lower house and upper house. So take the engagement where it's relevant. In terms of setting up a framework on which house you're going to take a POI from, common sense is your friend. I think if there's an opening government in this debate who hasn't set up a contest and have lost relevance, they're no longer the most crucial party in this debate. If opening opposition was the one who built the context, who provided the crux of the debate, then that's who you want to engage if you're CG. So you want to see who's the most relevant and who's creating the most important discussion, because you want to latch on to the discussion that's going to last the longest and interject yourself into that debate, because the discussion that lasts the longest is the core clash of the debate, and that's probably where most of the arguments will happen and where the judge will spend most of his time. So you need to be part of that discussion. If you're opening government and you see that a new discussion has happened in closing which you're not a part of, you need to aggressively use POIs to interject yourself into that discussion and somehow assert your relevance or reassert that something you did had a role to play in this happening in the first place. I think there's a question how to go into first ever BP debate tournament being used to schools for a long time. Yeah, I think that's what mostly we've been discussing. Something else you can also do is like pray and hope that you do well. Best of luck. I think there was a question earlier on opening government and closing opposition extension. Yeah. If OG doesn't get the chance to directly respond to CEO, how would you advise going about attempting to compare preempting their case? Also curious if preempting is associated with time. Okay, so if you're opening government, don't worry too much about cutting other teams off immediately. Your first priority should be to set up the most clear and concise case possible from opening government. So from opening government, you want to be as broad as possible and ensure a world where everyone feels that this is relevant, that this is the. Okay, so the last video that we were doing got cut off, so we'll start back up. I think we were talking about preemptives. So I think I'll wait a bit before all of you are back here, and then we'll start again. All right, cool. I think the hearts denote that you're back. So we were talking about preemptives. So don't feel a pressure to have that it's a necessary burden to preempt your opposition. Preempting is a bonus and something that's not a one-size-fits-all position thing, formula to sort of pursue. So if you're in upper house, if you're very fearful of a team in CO, you can think about preempting. But it's not just about CO, it's about op lines in general. So if you're going to do a debate about, let's say, giving prisoners the right to vote, one of the most common flaws that opposition will point out is what sort of prisoners, where do you draw a line? So then you preempt and integrate into your model or into your context about what you're going to allow or what you're going to not allow. And so that's how you strategically cut off our op lines in general. So when you prep, you have to think, sort of glance back and look at your arguments and see where the flaws in your own arguments are. Because op will be thinking of the same things. So don't focus on any specific house that you need to preempt, but focus on what weaknesses in your own case and your own case construction will potentially be called out by the adjudicator or by the debater, and how you can defend that. So that's where the focus is. But the primary purpose when you're OG, I would implore, is to lay the groundwork down to ensure everyone understands where this debate is happening. So clarity and precision is your number one priority from opening government, not preemptive. Preemptive is something that has to organically exist in your prep time to ensure that you filter out flaws in your case in the first place, right? So you want to present the most flawless version of your case and context. And the most flawless version of your case and context will automatically see you be doing preemptives anyway without you having to think too much about it. Cool. I think Tausif, you had a question about burning through material. If you could write that here again, I can get to it. Until then, what we can talk about is right. So I think this one's important, which is whip speeches from closing. Are you guys here? Comment with yes if you're here, and I'll continue because I think it's lagging for some people. Cool, I just have like 15 more minutes left to spare, so I'll just go through anyway and assume that you guys are here. So one group of members that we haven't talked about are the whips in extension. And this is really important because it's probably one of the most contested issues in debate, right? What role do whips play in lower house? So government whip. The government whip has to do rebuttals and has to engage with the opposition extension and sort of point out weaknesses in the opposition extension and what were the problems there. You also have to do a key thing, which is defend your previous speaker and ensure you fill in the blanks that they left behind. A very important part of the government whip speech is whipping your extension. What that means is your member came up and gave the extension. It's your job to highlight in this debate uniquely why that extension will win you this debate and why that's the most important aspect of this debate. So it's not just a general whip speech like you would do in a 3-on-3 debate, but a whip speech centered on why your member's speech and your member's content was extremely valuable and the most important and relevant comparative in this debate. So whip holistically, not just for the overall debate, not just to point out the weaknesses in opposition, but to reassert why your member gave the best speech. Cool. All right, so that question, so government whip also has the freedom to add some new examples, some new material. Opposition whip doesn't have the same freedom. Opposition whip has the burden to point out why they were distinct, particular, and important, and also whip their extension and reaffirm why their extension speaker was the best. So opposition whip speech is the speech where you want to do the most holistic summary of the debate. It should ideally be like a biased adjudication feedback where you point out why your team wins this debate and why other teams don't. So don't get too bogged up in bringing in new examples, new rebuttal. Holistic whipping, pointing out comparatives of each team should be enough to pull you through if your member has done a good job of adding new value and dynamics to the debate. All right, to get to the question about burning material, often times upper house burns a lot of essential material, but not how much is the analysis of the argument by one side opposing way up against the closing that has brought on new matter in the same debate. Right, I think it's very subjective and based on judge from judge, so there's no foolproof answer for this. But in the event that your extension matter is scorched through by Prime Minister, there has to be something in the upper house speech where they haven't focused on enough. So you need to, if you can't come up with something new, you need to, as I said earlier, figure out a particular aspect of this debate where you think you can interject yourself and prove yourselves to be the best team and make that a priority and convince the judge that this is where the game is at. The other thing to do is something opening usually fails to do because they're doing the context, because they're doing the setup, because they're engaging because they're putting up a model, is nuancing. So nuancing is like the mother of techniques to not nail down when you're in closing, because through a simple act of exploring additional layers, you will see yourself coming up with different arguments just during prep time itself. And always realize that when you're closing, your prep time doesn't end outside the room, it's ongoing when you're inside the room too. So here, the upper house debate clearly, try to divert them off onto different tangents to make sure that they don't have enough time to analyze and not scorch through everything. Even if they do, figure out where you can add additional layers and additional nuance. The simple act of putting yourself through that thought process should see you coming up with different areas of the debate which you can specifically enter and sort of distinguish yourself. How do you get better at distinguishing yourself as closing if, for instance, OG did a very good job at showing impact and characterizing, for instance? So I think it's the same answer. You nuance particular aspects and highlight why these were the best. So for example, OG can do a very excellent job of telling you why Donald Trump was a terrible president who deserves to get assassinated. But when you're lower, you probably can nuance this a lot further. So OG will probably say that minorities feel more violated, minorities feel more at risk, but you can sort of come in and nuance so many different other angles. So for example, what happens to things like how classes are taught, dynamics within a classroom, dynamics on campuses, so many different ways this can be impacted. Dynamics within a cabinet. So for example, the debate we did at Notre Dame Open about assassinating Donald Trump, there's a very strong upper house highlighting flaws of Trump administration, but from lower house there was a lot of individual nuancing on how Trump is as a person, how his cabinet are as individuals, what those characteristics mean for society as a whole. So BP forces you to think in depth about things which otherwise would have just been on the surface. So you have to put yourselves at lower house through that extra amount of thinking. So of course there will be a fear that OG will say everything, but it's usually not humanly possible for them to do this. There is an additional layer that they will always miss out. So it's up to you to sort of work that in. You can either do the additional analysis of nuancing and finding new layers and making that the most important part of the debate. You can do relevant engagement and comparatives, and this is really important because opening government will never have the ability to holistically assess every team in the debate and mark out why they were the best. But you as closing do have that ability. So if you can add new value, you have the ability to compare that as well. In terms of how to distinguish yourself, if you don't have new material, of course that's difficult. So you have to have something. In the event that you have no new material, you can either see what OG analyzed the least and what they missed out and any blanks they left unfilled, and see if you can make anything of that in terms of nuancing and layering. Another thing you can try to do is use your rhetorical ability to repackage something OG was trying to run but did not frame in the best way, and sort of frame that, connect that to different stakeholders and present that as a unique contribution that you're making. It's the most common tactic pursued in British parliamentary debating, which is repackaging upper house argument, adding in some extra nuance. So a combination of all of those things is usually a good way to sort of distinguish yourself at lower house. Okay, but sometimes from closing, it's hard if opening's basics characterization is off. If that is the case, is recharacterization okay? So that's Afnan's question. Recharacterization is absolutely okay. Strategically, it will also be lauded and applauded with the fact that you're doing this. People will be really happy that if you're recorrecting a debate. But where you have to be sure is your framing and your language. People usually come up and say something like, oh, they were really stupid, so this is the actual debate. You should be a lot more subtle than that. You should be coming up and saying that to recharacterize, we want to recharacterize the debate because we feel this is the most contextual issue in the debate and this is where the debate lies. And then you sort of start recharacterizing the debate according to how you see fit. Okay, so definitely in debates where opening is off and opening opposition doesn't correct it, closing has the burden of recharacterizing the debate and sort of recontextualizing it. Debates often slip into lower house when that happens. If your opening opposition and your opening government has completely made a mess of the motion, do not challenge the definition. That's an auto fourth in British parliamentary debating. But what you do is sort of engage them and tilt them towards the direction where you want the debate to be. So paint the right picture for them and hope that the DPM sort of realigns and comes back at you in response to it. If he doesn't, it's pretty unlucky. But you have to keep going as opening opposition and wait for closing to sort of engage you and ensure that the debate then happens at a cross between OG and the lower, between OO and the lower house teams. If you're OG and you think you have a weak opening opposition or an opening opposition who might potentially mess the debate up, it's recommended that it's okay to sort of nudge opening opposition towards where you want the debate to be. So you can say that this is an engagement we expect from opening opposition, or opening opposition has a burden to engage us on this. These sort of strong hints will at least give opening opposition some direction of where they should engage you. The benefit of doing this is it allows for relevant engagement where it otherwise may not have existed. So that's really important and will be a useful tool for you. Cool. Any more questions, guys? Right. I think we can talk about this, right? So, last few things we'll discuss until you have questions is some common tactics to help you contextualize. I'm sure most of you know this stuff already, but just for a refresher, right? Um, every time a motion is given, you have to think about why this motion was given in the first place. Usually it has been given because there is a crisis or issue related to this motion somewhere, and you have to nail down what the status quo is and where this crisis is existing. Based on that, the contextualization that you do should be a painting of the harms that are taking place, the ongoing harms and the ongoing trend and where this is escalating. And that escalation will always lead to a tipping point. And the tipping point is sort of the breaking point where you as an OG say enough is enough, we have to act. So your first few minutes are a build up to this tipping point where the urgency is at its max. And that gives you gravitas and shows that OG has to act. So your contextualization can build up to like this multiple harms have led to this one massive harm, and now OG must come in and do something. And that sets you up to bring in your new argumentation or bring in your new model. Opening opposition sort of does the opposite to this, where you can show that whatever OG is trying to introduce is not worth the harms, will lead to some sort of backlash that leads to more harms outweighing the benefit that OG proposes, or you can argue against the context altogether. So, for example, in the South China Sea or in international relations, context is always changing. So, at one point, supporting US military intervention was a very popular thing. But in today's context, probably not, because so many things have changed, like political dynamics, military dynamics, etc. So you can point out changing context and organic changes, how you would rather have things change organically and argue those. So you can put up a contesting story to what OG is painting and have your version of the world try and interject it into the debate to make yourself relevant. Third thing to discuss is something that's not done a lot in British parliamentary debating, but should be done more, which is you are not bound by whatever opening government is trying to set. If you feel you can do a better job of solving the problem in the opening government, you have the liberty of counter-propping them and giving your own context or your own model of where you think this debate should be and how this problem should be solved. And the adjudicator will assess that fairly if it's relevant and if it has the right amount of argumentation. If you're closing and you've identified where the problem and the solution that's being discussed at upper house, figure out where the gap is between the problem and the solution and tailor make your argument according to that and why you're the best team in the debate to solve this. Final thing I will say, as a team in a British parliamentary debate, you need to be the most memorable team in the debate. So as it ends, what you want the judge to do is listen to your framing, listen to your extensions, and listen to how you flag things. If the judge is doing all of that and you frame correctly, the judge will have in his mind like a clear stance of what each team represents. So sort of think of it as like an engraving on your tombstone. So if Abir Ershad passes away, his tombstone will probably say guy with sad boy memes all the time on Facebook. The judge needs to nail you down to a particular epitaph or to a particular stance. So your framing and your flagging of your material has to be pinpoint and distinct. So the judge can pinpoint and say, okay, opening was the one who brought in the really important model into the debate. Opposition was the one who engaged on that model. Closing was the one who talked about this particular aspect. Closing was the one who talked about this particular aspect. Think of it as stances which differentiate you. And then the judge will make a comparison of which stance was the most relevant and most important in the debate. So you have to avoid being generic. You have to ensure there's a distinct identity of your speeches and of your team stance. And that distinct identity will ensure you can sort of last longer in the debate, right? And that will allow the judge to remember you. So every BP debate you're doing is a battle against being forgotten and a battle against being irrelevant. So you have to keep yourself alive in the debate and pick stances which judge can latch onto as your identity. Okay, as a CEO, sometimes you have your case premised in a completely different context, which you might feel is more relevant, but get lost on picture. That's not understanding. Yeah, debated on. Okay, this is tricky. So it can be possible that as a CEO, you can argue that this is the most important context and where the debate is. And if CG responds to it, it just might work out for you. But I think the safest thing to do, because you are arguing basically one speech in CEO, is to sort of readjust and align yourself with the rest of the debate. Even if that's compromised your prep time, as a closing opposition, you have an ample amount of time within the debate, right? So you sort of assess things as they are and reshift. That is the challenge of British parliamentary debating. In 3-on-3, you prep something, off prep something, you have a face off. In BP, you can prep something, but it can change based on any of the other members and their content. So you have to be alive in the debate and listen to everything to make sure you can readjust. If your premise is lost out, then you have to adjust to the premise that everyone else is going with, because you run the risk of being isolated. So again, here you have to apply your subjective assessment. If the debate is on, if 3 teams are in a debate you think is absolutely not the most relevant debate, you have to drag all of them into your debate. Whether that's through POIs, whether that's through forcefully recontextualizing, you have to try and drag them in and take control of the debate. If you feel that perhaps you prepped wrong, this is where the discussion is. You have to readjust your material and align yourself with the rest of the debate and make yourselves relevant there. That is the hardest part of BP dynamics, but that's also the challenge. So there's no foolproof plan for that one. You have to readjust and plan as you go. That's the biggest difference between 3-on-3 and BP, where it's a continuous process of thinking, and so you have to continuously think and stay alive in the debate and base your material accordingly. Okay, last few questions. We will wrap this up at 10:25. It's 10:20 now. I will then be going to pick up the foreign judges who are here for you at IUB Ascension 2017. And I think I can try and convince them to maybe do a Facebook Live for you guys tomorrow if they're free. Cool. So I don't think there are many questions coming. Okay. Okay, I'll like your comment. Like. Yeah, I'll definitely speak to them and see if they're okay taking a session on Facebook. I think they'll be really happy to do it for you because there's not a lot to do in Dhaka, so I'm sure they have to kill time somehow. An argument already explained by opening house, the closing house frames it in a new way. How much credit will I receive? Well, it's not just about saying synonyms. You have to have some sort of material attached under that frame. So if opening government says that we regret social media as a primary source of news because it leads to confusion, and you come up and say that we regret social media as a primary source of news distribution because it misleads people, it's the same thing. So then you don't get any credit. But if you follow that up with the harms of being misled are this, it's forming preconceived opinions, creating divide, creating backlash, etc., then the judge will credit you. So it's about what's under the framing and not necessarily the framing itself. The framing is a tool that helps you improve your argumentation and have your argumentation remembered. It is not necessarily your argumentation. Three minutes, guys. Anything else? Right, so I'll just take the minutes of awkward silence to do some more promotion. So we unveiled takeout as a partner. Mad Chef fans were upset at that. So on Thursday we will be serving takeout, but on Friday we will be serving Mad Chef. So you actually get to have both while you're at IUB. So I think that's a good thing. Tips on how to approach BP prep time as compared to 3 versus 3 prep time. Okay, so I think it's how I answered your question before. 3 on 3 prep time usually doesn't continue. It's something very preset. BP, you have to be open and flexible to change and be ready to adapt. The most important thing to do is figure out where the debate's happening and where to make yourselves relevant. The prep time for upper house is pinpointing where the crisis is, how to make your speech very urgent. So it has to have like a particular tipping point which makes your team the most relevant in the debate and have clear and concise argumentation. So everyone has to understand what OG's stance is and where it's headed. OO should prep like the typical offline that's expected, but has to be very ready to adjust based on what PM is saying and make the call of what not to engage and what to engage. You don't want to engage stuff that will drag you down and force you like into a mire of like ridiculous back and forth arguments. You need to stay sort of above everything and have a clear stance for each team. For closing, you try to prep as many arguments as you can. What you sort of take the extra minutes out to do is figure out which framing can make you the most distinct in the debate and see where OG and OO are missing out and how you can fill in those holes for your credit. And again, I will reassert to the whip speakers that you guys are probably potentially the game changers in this debate. So last speeches have a really good chance of making good impression on the adjudicator. So it's not just about common whip speeches where you identify clashes. You do that, sure, but why you're the best particular team in this debate and why your stance is the most memorable and the one that it absolutely has to consider has to come through. So keep those in mind when you're prepping. BP is a lot more sales pitch than a battle. What are you jealous of, Darima? Nabil's not here. Oh, totally. Right. With that said, I think we have I've tried to cover as much as I could. Like, thanks for the invite. It's a really cool thing that you guys are doing, and I will see you guys over the weekend. And I hope you have a great time at Ascension. See you. And if you haven't filled up the tab registration form, please do. Like, it's really annoying. Cool. Thank you. Bye.